The story of what happened in Rostov does not begin with a scream, a body, or even a crime. It begins with silence. A long, heavy silence that wrapped itself around the Soviet Union like a winter coat made of lead. Silence was safety to the authorities, a shield against political embarrassment. Silence was order. But for the people who lived in the shadows of that silence, it became something else entirely. It became the perfect environment for a predator to grow, unseen and unchallenged. In the late 1970s, as factories roared and propaganda declared the triumph of socialism, a thin man with quiet eyes slipped unnoticed through train stations and wooded paths. He blended into crowds as easily as smoke disappears into the cold air. There was nothing remarkable about his presence, nothing that warned anyone of the darkness living beneath his skin. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, though to the city of Rostov, he would eventually become something far more haunting, a figure whispered about in fear long before the authorities dared admit he existed at all. He had been shaped by hunger, born into famine, raised in deprivation, molded by humiliation. Stories of cannibalism during the desperate years of his childhood were whispered by his mother as if they were bedtime tales. Whether they were true or a distorted warning meant to keep him obedient, no one could say. But for a sensitive, frightened boy with a mind already forming cracks, these stories settled inside him like seeds. His world smelled of starvation, dirt floors, and bitter winters. Children mocked him, teachers ignored him, and adults dismissed him as weak, strange, or simply invisible. He learned early that survival meant hiding your true emotions, burying your shame, and retreating into a private world where fantasies replaced failures. As he grew older, his body betrayed him in ways that deepened his internal wounds. Attempts at intimacy led only to humiliation. Every rejection carved another scar into his sense of identity, twisting pleasure into something unrecognizable. He learned to equate power with validation, control with satisfaction. But on the surface, he remained a quiet, awkward man who followed rules, joined the Communist Party, kept his head lowered at work, and never caused trouble. No one suspected that desperation was simmering just beneath his calm exterior. In 1978, his desperation finally slipped its leash. The exact moment cannot be pinpointed, whether it happened on a walk home through a wooded shortcut, or while watching a child playing alone, or during one of his long, lonely nights filled with thoughts he tried and failed to push away. But the first disappearance came quietly, without the fanfare or horror that would later shake the region. A young girl in Shakti vanished. Her absence should have been cause for alarm. But this was the Soviet Union, and missing persons were an inconvenience, not a priority. When she was found, the truth of what happened to her was buried quickly. Authorities pinned the blame on someone who couldn't defend himself, a man with limited cognitive ability coerced into confessing crimes he didn't commit. Andrei watched from the shadows as police closed the case, not because they lacked evidence, but because the system demanded order, not messy truths. It was in this moment that a switch flipped inside him. If the world refused to see the truth, he realized, then he could walk freely within its blind spots. No one was coming for him. No one even believed someone like him could exist. And so the killings began. Rostov, a city already weary from economic stagnation, soon became a place where fear clung to every street corner. Children disappeared on their way to school. Teenagers vanished near bus stops. Young women stepped off trains and never came home. At first, each disappearance seemed isolated, an unfortunate tragedy, a runaway, a domestic issue, an accident. The authorities, desperate to maintain the myth that serious crime was a Western disease, refused to connect the dots. But the people of Rostov felt the dread long before officials acknowledged it. They spoke in whispers about bodies being found in wooded areas. Parents forbade their children from traveling alone. Rumors of a dark figure haunting the forest spread through workplaces and communal apartments. No one could say exactly who he was, only that the fear growing in their stomachs felt justified. Andrei moved through this atmosphere like a ghost. He used his unremarkable appearance to disappear into crowds. He had learned from his first crime that police were not hunters, they were bureaucrats. They arrested convenient suspects, pressured confessions, and closed cases to satisfy political expectations. He understood their weaknesses better than they understood their own investigation. He targeted those who hovered at society's fragile edges: runaways, orphans, children from chaotic households, youths traveling between towns. They were the ones least likely to be missed quickly, least likely to create problems for the authorities, least likely to trigger meaningful investigations. To him, they were opportunities. To the system, they were statistics. As the years passed, the bodies began to form a pattern too chilling to ignore. Each victim was found in natural settings: woods, fields, riverbanks, places where nature itself seemed to swallow their final screams. Although no graphic detail will be described, investigators later found clear indications that the killer took time at each scene, lost in a ritualistic frenzy that seemed less about violence and more about trying to fill a void inside himself, a void carved by decades of shame, rejection, and psychological torment. It was control he craved most, not just over his victims, but over his own sense of worth. By the early 1980s, the case reached a terrifying scale. The Ministry of Internal Affairs quietly assembled a task force, but even in private meetings, officials refused to utter the words serial killer. The concept itself was considered a Western invention, incompatible with the ideals of the socialist utopia the USSR claimed to be. To admit such a predator could flourish within its borders was to admit the system's failure. The lead investigators were forced to work under impossible conditions. No media alerts. No public warnings. No cooperation between regions. No acknowledgement of patterns. They sifted through files late into the night, comparing autopsy reports, interview transcripts, and witness accounts, always behind closed doors, always fearing bureaucratic backlash more than the killer himself. Meanwhile, Andrei watched their efforts with quiet amusement. He often returned to the same train stations where police staked out benches and pathways. Sometimes he stood so close to officers that he could hear snippets of their conversations. They were hunting a phantom, an idea they could not fully articulate. Andrei, with his timid smile and soft voice, remained invisible even when they looked directly at him. He learned the rhythms of human movement: when crowds thinned, when children were left alone, when workers took shortcuts through wooded paths. The terrain around Rostov became an extension of his darkest impulses. The forests, with their twisting trails and dense thickets, offered perfect concealment. Rain washed away footprints. Snow buried evidence. The earth itself seemed to conspire with him, swallowing traces of his actions before investigators could arrive. Many victims trusted him at first. His demeanor was disarming, almost pitiful. He seemed like someone seeking conversation rather than offering danger. His soft-spoken nature lulled people into lowering their guard. Those who walked with him into secluded areas likely believed they were helping a confused stranger or simply keeping company with a harmless man. What they encountered instead was a boiling storm that lived beneath his quiet exterior. A storm released only when he felt completely unseen. As the killings increased, investigators began noticing one disturbing detail. The killer returned to the same general region over and over again. He was familiar with the geography, comfortable with the landscape, confident enough to operate repeatedly within a small radius. This suggested he lived in or frequently traveled through the Rostov area. The task force began interviewing local men who fit certain profiles. Andrei appeared on their radar multiple times. His name was recorded, his odd behavior noted, his nervousness observed. But each time something intervened: his party membership, his employment record, or the lack of direct evidence. Investigators who suspected him could not get authorization to take further steps. Higher authorities insisted the killings were unrelated incidents, each committed by different individuals. The idea that one man could be responsible for dozens of crimes conflicted with the very ideology they were sworn to uphold. Twice Andrei was detained, twice he was released. In later interviews, officers admitted feeling uneasy during interactions with him. His eyes wandered too much. His voice trembled at questions that should not have been difficult. His explanations sounded rehearsed, but without permission to pursue him aggressively, they had to let him walk out the door. Each time he returned to freedom, he carried with him a renewed sense of invincibility. He believed fate, or perhaps the weakness of the Soviet system, was protecting him. His crimes escalated accordingly. He grew bolder, more confident, more consumed by the fantasies that drove him. The act of evasion became part of the thrill. People began avoiding the woods surrounding Rostov. Parents escorted children to train stations. Rumors hardened into widespread fear. Villagers whispered prayers when they passed the outskirts of town. But the authorities remained outwardly calm, unwilling to admit the true scale of danger. The city's soul seemed to darken with each passing month. A heaviness settled over workplaces and schools. Grocery lines buzzed with speculation. Even those who didn't know the details sensed something unnatural was moving among them, something that watched from behind trees or waited near railroad switches where weeds grew tall, and the air always smelled faintly of rust. Andrei walked through this world unnoticed, blending into the anxious crowds. On the surface, he appeared tired, worn out from work, carrying groceries or reading glasses in his coat pocket. No one thought twice when he stood beside them at bus stops. No one saw the shadows behind his polite smile. But inside him, the storm continued to grow. And while the people of Rostov tried to carry on with their daily lives, the darkness that followed him stretched further and further across the region, swallowing more victims, more families, more hope. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. The nightmare unfolding across Rostov deepened with each passing year, not in sudden explosions of terror, but in the slow, crawling way darkness spreads under a closed door. People lived their lives, went to work, stood in food lines, read the same carefully controlled newspapers, but beneath the routine of Soviet existence, a quiet dread took root. The citizens of the region sensed something hunting them, something invisible yet close enough to touch. Andrei Chikatilo moved through that atmosphere with eerie ease, drifting among crowds like a shadow that refused to cast itself. By the mid-1980s, his crimes had multiplied to the point where investigators could no longer pretend the deaths and disappearances were isolated accidents. Too many bodies had appeared in forests and fields. Too many victims had been found near the same railway lines, the same wooded gullies, the same desolate outskirts. Though they still could not speak openly, the officers on the case began to admit to each other, in hushed voices, that the pattern was unmistakable. But patterns meant little in a country that forbade acknowledging the existence of serial predators. Police were forced to justify every crime individually, to develop separate theories, to chase suspects with no connection to one another. The truth sat inside their files, repetitive, undeniable, horrifying, and yet they were forbidden to name it. The killer flourished inside that enforced blindness. Each time officials dismissed connections, Andrei grew more confident. Each time a coerced confession closed a case, he walked away feeling protected. Yet investigators persisted, even when they were discouraged. Some worked themselves into illness trying to keep up with the sheer volume of evidence. They traveled between rural villages, interviewed grieving families who often had to whisper their suspicions for fear of angering officials. They collected soil samples, compared witness statements, analyzed autopsy results for psychological patterns. Their desks were covered in maps dotted with pins, forming a constellation of terror stretching across Rostov Oblast. Meanwhile, Andrei continued his life of contradictions. At home, he was a husband, a father. His children saw him as strict but not frightening. His wife believed he was troubled, perhaps, but harmless. He sat at the dinner table with the same hands that had taken so many lives, hands she assumed were only weary from work. He tucked himself into bed beside her without revealing the storm that lived beneath his calm exterior. To his coworkers, he was forgettable, a man who worked, complained quietly, avoided confrontation, and rarely raised his voice. He felt safer than other men, safer than the drunks or the aggressive types or the ones who bragged loudly in factories. He was invisible because he had perfected invisibility as an art. He carried himself like someone apologizing for taking up space. And people excused his oddness as simply part of his personality. But while he moved silently through his daily routines, his mind never stopped its descent into obsession. Each crime fed a compulsion, and each compulsion heightened his need to kill again. But this had nothing to do with rage. Investigators later noted that Andrei did not radiate anger in the traditional sense. His violence came not from fury, but from emptiness. It was as though some part of him had died long ago, leaving behind a hollow place that sought to be filled through acts of domination. The secrecy of his crimes made him feel powerful in a life where he otherwise felt weak. The ability to evade detection made him feel chosen, protected by something dark and wordless. The forests he used as hunting grounds became sanctuaries for him. He knew which paths were rarely traveled, which depressions in the earth hid footprints, which thickets muffled sound. He learned how to observe people without being observed himself. He waited for those who appeared vulnerable or distracted, watching them with a gaze that never revealed itself. Those who crossed his path often sensed nothing, no warning, no spark of recognition, no instinct telling them to run. He had become the perfect predator for a society that refused to believe predators existed. Yet even in a country steeped in denial, the weight of the crimes eventually grew impossible to ignore. Investigators began setting traps. They monitored train stations. They patrolled wooded areas. They created psychological profiles, rudimentary by Western standards but groundbreaking for the Soviet system. They theorized that the killer was educated, socially awkward, and likely someone who struggled with intimacy. They believed he might be connected to the locations through work or habitual travel. They believed he was someone who blended into daily life, someone unremarkable, someone who watched children without drawing suspicion. They were closer to identifying him than they realized. Andrei passed through these checkpoints, these watched areas, these searches, countless times. More than once, officers reported noticing a thin, nervous man loitering near train platforms, sometimes engaging children in conversation. But he carried identification from the factory where he worked. He had membership in the Communist Party. He had no criminal record, and when questioned, he answered politely, even apologetically, as though embarrassed by the attention. He slipped through their fingers again and again. The investigation suffered another blow from within, pressure from Moscow. High-ranking officials demanded an end to the panic. They insisted the case was damaging the image of Soviet stability. They threatened demotions and reprimands for investigators who proposed what they called Western fantasies about serial killers. Newspapers printed stories blaming hooligans, drifters, or Western influence. Rumors were suppressed. Families who spoke too openly were silenced. Meanwhile, Andrei's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. When he wasn't killing, he spiraled between depression and agitation. He berated himself for his failures as a man, as a father, as a husband. He experienced long stretches of self-loathing, followed by sudden surges of desire to hunt again. He would pace through his apartment at night, staring out windows as though watching for something only he could see. His wife chalked up his mood swings to stress, exhaustion, or possibly an illness he refused to discuss. Some of the officers investigating the case later admitted they felt as though they were chasing a ghost. They described long nights spent sifting through evidence that pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke of the frustration that came from bureaucratic interference, from being told to stop looking for one killer when the evidence clearly showed a pattern. They spoke of the hopelessness that grew heavier with each body discovered. They knew a monster was stalking their region, and yet they could not warn the people who needed protection most. Still, they continued searching, and their efforts eventually led them closer to the truth. Witnesses began to describe a similar figure more consistently. A thin man, balding, wearing glasses, dressed poorly, with a nervous manner and a soft voice. Someone they had seen near victims shortly before their disappearance. Someone whose face they could not forget even though it seemed like the kind of face crowds swallow whole. Andrei matched these descriptions almost perfectly. When investigators questioned him again in the mid-1980s, they noted his trembling hands, his evasive answers, the strange combination of fear and eagerness in his demeanor. They felt his anxiety radiating from him in waves, yet he maintained a facade of politeness. He even seemed relieved to be questioned, as though part of him wanted to be caught but was terrified of what being caught would mean. Still lacking permission to act decisively, they let him go. Shortly after his release, Andrei returned to his hunting grounds, more desperate than ever. His crimes became sloppy, impulsive. He took greater risks, approached victims in more visible locations, and ignored the precautions he once relied on. The pressure of the investigation, combined with his growing inner turmoil, fed his compulsions in a destructive cycle. He killed more frequently, his needs spiraling out of control. One evening, he stood on a train platform watching passengers disembark. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving only the dim glow of station lamps. He scanned the crowd with a detached gaze, noting who seemed alone, who seemed distracted, who seemed afraid. Fear, ironically, made certain individuals more appealing to him. The scent of vulnerability drew him like a magnet. People walked past him without realizing they were being evaluated by a predator, whose face blended into the background as easily as an old coat forgotten on a bench. He followed a teenager toward the edge of the platform, keeping a calculated distance. His steps were soft, his expression bland, his posture unthreatening. No one noticed him slip away into the night with her. No one noticed he returned alone. By this time, the task force was exhausted, demoralized, and desperate. Their supervisors demanded results. Families demanded answers. Entire villages whispered about the evil spirit haunting their forests. Some believed it was a demon. Others believed it was punishment for societal decay. Few dared to believe it was a man, because believing that meant admitting vulnerability, admitting the system could not protect its people. But one investigator, a criminologist named Bukhanovsky, introduced a groundbreaking idea, a psychological profile that described the killer's inner world, not just his external behavior. He suggested the murderer was someone who appeared insignificant, someone who struggled with relationships, someone who oscillated between self-hatred and compulsive desire, someone whose crimes were attempts to reclaim control over a life defined by humiliation. The description fit Andrei almost perfectly. Yet he still walked free. He continued wandering through forests, his breath visible in the cold air, his footsteps muffled by layers of fallen leaves. He knew the terrain like a map of his own mind, twisting, dark, full of hidden traps. Sometimes he returned to old sites, not to revisit the past in a literal sense, but to relive the emotional surge he felt there. These places had become monuments to his secret life, markers of the void he was trying to fill. In Rostov, fear turned into something heavier. People began carrying makeshift weapons. Mothers clutched children's hands with white knuckles. Teenagers who once wandered freely now hurried home before dusk. The atmosphere grew electric, tense, suffocating. Everyone sensed an unseen watcher lingering nearby. Andrei thrived in that tension. The investigation, however, was starting to catch up. Surveillance increased. Officers disguised themselves at train stations. They monitored suspicious men more closely. They kept lists of frequent travelers and cataloged behaviors that matched the emerging profile. They worked tirelessly, even as they were denied media cooperation or public alerts. Eventually, fate pushed the killer closer to detection. One day, Andrei was spotted leaving a wooded area near a railway station. His clothing was disheveled, his hands dirty, his demeanor anxious. Officers noted his behavior and reported it. His name, which had appeared in their files multiple times, was elevated for review once more. This time, the pattern was too strong to ignore. But even then, even when the walls of silence were beginning to crack, the system hesitated. Bureaucracy stalled. Files moved slowly. Decisions were delayed. In that hesitancy, more victims fell into his hands. Andrei continued walking freely down streets lined with birch trees and concrete apartment blocks, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. He felt both hunted and protected, terrified and unstoppable. He sensed something closing in around him, yet he believed he could slip through it again like mist. The city watched him without knowing who he was. And the nightmare continued its spread. By the time the investigation tightened around him, the region of Rostov had grown accustomed to fear. It lingered in schools, in factories, in the long shadows cast by evening trains. The task force had spent years assembling fragments, patterns, witness descriptions, behavioral traits, and slowly the silhouette of the killer had taken shape. Though bureaucracy still hindered them, the investigators no longer doubted what they were dealing with. And somewhere within that silhouette, the shape of a man who blended into crowds too easily began to emerge. Despite the mounting pressure, Andrei continued to drift through train stations and wooded paths, driven by compulsions he could no longer control. His sense of invincibility had begun to fracture, replaced with bursts of paranoia he tried to smother with routine. Yet he kept returning to the same hunting grounds, as though unable to imagine a world where he could be stopped. The anxiety that gnawed at him never stopped him. If anything, it made the compulsion stronger. Late in 1990, at a station outside Rostov, police were conducting covert surveillance. Officers observed passengers as they disembarked, focusing on anyone whose behavior matched the psychological profile they had spent years refining. One of the officers noticed a familiar figure, a thin, balding man with a nervous demeanor, wearing a coat that looked too large for him. He was packing near a wooded area behind the station, glancing around in a way that suggested more than casual curiosity. His eyes searched the movements of others with a sharpness that belied his meek posture. The officer recognized him. His name had appeared in the investigation too many times. His interviews had always left investigators uneasy. Now he was here again, near the edge of the trees. He was not walking toward the station. He was watching it. When approached, he offered weak explanations for his presence. He claimed he was looking for a bus, but his route made no sense. He said he had been walking for hours, yet his shoes were strangely clean. His hands trembled when he pulled out his identification. The officers let him go, but this time they didn't dismiss the encounter. They reported it immediately. The task force now had reason to bring him back in. He was arrested days later. Unlike earlier detentions, this one carried weight. Investigators had built a mountain of circumstantial evidence, patterns of movement, witness sightings, inconsistencies in his statements, his uncanny proximity to multiple crime scenes. They had also found traces of physical evidence on clothing he had discarded. For the first time, they were allowed to keep him in custody long enough to press forward. During questioning, Andrei tried to project the same timid, cooperative persona he had always relied on. He smiled weakly, avoided eye contact, and attempted to charm investigators with long-winded explanations about his life, his hardships, his health problems. But his voice was thinner than before, his composure more fragile. He sensed that this time the police were not going to release him easily. Investigators attempted direct confrontation, but he denied everything. He insisted he was being targeted unfairly. He claimed to be a victim of circumstance, a misunderstood man who kept finding himself in the wrong place. But the walls were closing in, and he knew it. His denials grew desperate, even theatrical. It was at this point that criminologist Alexander Bukhanovsky, the man who crafted the psychological profile that shadowed the investigation, was brought in to speak with him. Bukhanovsky did not question him like a policeman. He spoke to him as though he understood him, his fears, his fantasies, the fractures in his mind. He described the loneliness, the compulsions, the emotional hunger that defined the killer's internal world. He spoke of humiliation, of the need for control, of the psychological void that could only be filled temporarily through acts of domination. As he listened, Andrei began to tremble. It was the first time someone had put words to the darkness inside him. He felt seen, not as the man he pretended to be, but as the creature he truly was. His shoulders slumped. His breathing slowed. Something inside him cracked. And then he began to talk. The confession spilled out of him in waves, long, rambling, uncontrolled. He spoke for hours, recounting details only the killer could know. He described his victim's final moments not with pride, but with a strange mixture of shame and relief. As though unburdening himself of secrets he had carried for far too long. He didn't revel in the horror. He seemed consumed by it, trapped by it, compelled to relive it in words because he had no other way to feel whole. Investigators who listened later described the experience as chilling not because of the gruesome nature of the crimes, which cannot be elaborated here, but because of the emptiness in his voice. It was the emptiness of someone confessing to inevitable acts, not choices. He confessed to dozens of killings, 50, possibly more. Each confession matched locations investigators had struggled to connect. Each recollection filled a gap in their maps, their endless files, their sleepless nights spent trying to understand the monster stalking their land. The nightmare they had been fighting was suddenly given a face, a human face. A face that had walked past them at train stations, stood beside them on buses, blended into crowds, and smiled politely during interviews. After the confession, the weight on the task force shifted from pursuit to documentation. They traced his steps across years of terror, revisiting sites he described, confirming details he provided, speaking again to witnesses who now realized they had once been in the presence of a killer. Investigators felt both satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction that the nightmare was finally ending. Anger that bureaucracy and silence had allowed it to continue for so long. When news of the arrest finally reached the public, it spread like wildfire. The silence that had protected him for years shattered. People gathered outside police buildings, some shouting insults, others simply staring into the distance as though trying to absorb the impossible truth. Parents who had feared a nameless evil for years learned that the predator had been a man who could stand quietly behind them in line without drawing attention. Rumors became reality. Fear became rage. His trial in 1992 was unlike anything the Soviet, or by then, Russian, public had ever seen.